Yeah, we haven't fallen out yet.
Yep. Which is great. So yeah, please join me in welcoming Paul.
Hi. Hi everyone, nice to see you all. I'm going to be talking about critical thinking, which I realise is not a subject which is a hugest barrel of laughs. However, I hope it'll be clear and I hope it'll be interesting. I've got quite a lot to get through, so here we go. I think I said in my abstract I would try and weight it towards the practical, the how, rather than the what and the why. So I'll try and get through the what and the why as quickly as possible. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks also for Teach to Writer, who I hope are sponsoring me. I will see. So here we go. Most talks on critical thinking begin by saying how many definitions there are of critical thinking. I'm sure, and quite a lot of them start by asking participants what their definition of critical thinking is. I'm not actually going to do that. I'm simply going to let you take it as written that there are a lot of definitions. What I'm more interested in, I mean, if we look at just a couple, this talk won't be an exception then in that respect. Some of them, like this one here, focus on its metacognitive aspect. Some of them more on its rational aspect here. I think what's interesting about the number of definitions is really that there's a problem with it, and the problem is that people seem to think that because there are so many definitions, critical thinking itself is rather a woolly idea, that it's a kind of 21st century buzzword more than a sort of clearly defined educational concept. And I think that's unfair myself in a way, because if you look at all the definitions, and believe me, I've looked at a lot, three themes keep recurring. And the first of those themes is that it is about reflective thinking. That is to say, about questioning, about being curious, about questioning, it's kind of the habit of questioning assumptions, your own included, particularly. And if we just look at a quote from the person who is supposed to have coined the term, John Dewey, who wrote a book called How We Think in 1910. It was a sort of philosophical book. This is what he said, and he said it rather beautifully, actually. If the suggestion that occurs is at once accepted, then we have uncritical thinking, the minimum of reflection. To turn the thing over in the mind, to reflect, means to hunt for additional evidence, for new data that will develop the suggestion and will either bear it out or else make obvious its absurdity and irrelevance. Okay? So that's the first thing, that it's about questioning and about being curious and not just accepting the information that's put before you. If it's about questioning, then the obvious thing to ask next is, what questions do you ask? What questions would you ask? Well, again, if you go online, you will find a lot of kind of prescriptions of what these questions might be. They range in length from 3 questions like this: why, what if, what else, to, I saw online when I was looking this up, 70 questions a good critical thinker should ask. Or who's going to remember that? There's another problem with that about being prescriptive, that it almost seems to go against the whole idea of critical thinking, which is about being open-minded and sort of curious. So why would you be prescriptive about it? So that's the first thing. It's about reflective thinking. The second thing is that it's about rational thinking, or reasoned thinking, if you like. And if you go to a lot of university websites, you'll see that kind of, where they mention critical thinking, you'll see that that's the aspect really most emphasized by people in academia, that it's about objectivity. The ability, they say here, this is the Hong Kong University, to think clearly and rationally about what to do or believe. So what they're trying to do, what universities often are trying to do, is to create thinkers, this is in Siegel's words, who are appropriately moved by reasons. and who can grasp the relevance of different reasons and then weigh those reasons. So evaluate them properly. So it has that rational aspect. The last thing is that it's about reasonable thinking, and this is a very often cited definition. It's a very good definition. I like this one of all the ones we looked at, all the ones I'll show you. This is probably the closest to my own way of thinking. It's reasonable, reflective thinking focused on deciding what to believe or do. I think if you, to kind of convey this idea of reasonable thinking, it's quite good to look at this quote from the philosopher Bertrand Russell. And he was talking about philosophical inquiry. And what he said was always ask what are the facts and what's the truth that those facts, that the facts bear out. So don't let yourself be diverted either by what you want to believe or by what you think could have beneficent social effects if it were believed. Only look look only and surely at what are the facts. Now, I don't think anyone would kind of disagree with that sentiment. It's a very good sentiment. The problem is, of course, we all know, particularly in the internet age, is that the facts are not always available to us. They're either unavailable or they're incomplete. And so a critical thinker in that case must either reserve judgment and say, no, I can't make a judgment on this because I don't have the facts available to me, or, as happens more often, must come to some kind of reasonable judgment about what the facts of the situation are and therefore what the right course of action is going to be. So, rather than take a long definition that tries to include everything, or a shorter, pithy definition which doesn't quite work, I'd much prefer to see critical thinking in this way, as a kind of mindset, as a kind of approach, a global approach to the way we think and learn that encompasses these three things, that encompasses reflective thinking, rational thinking, and reasonable thinking. So it's not just a box of tools to be used and then put away, but it's something which derives from seeking knowledge in a particular way. It's kind of an approach, a mindset, if you like. Dewey, the guy we mentioned before, who said it was kind of about reflective thinking, and who talked about what was uncritical thinking, called it a kind of healthy skepticism. I think it's very important, I think that's a good way of putting it, but I think it's very important when you put it like that, not to think of it as a kind of cynical or subversive idea. It doesn't necessarily mean that. The idea is not to challenge ideas aggressively, but just to seek to find out how they were arrived at, how knowledge was arrived at. Okay. Good. So that's the what. Are we all clear so far? Good. And so, yeah, if you want to raise that critical mindset among your students, or you want to see to what extent they possess it, you could do a little activity. Sorry, I beg your pardon. That's what we're going to do now. And you could give them a statement. This is just a statement I chose. It could be any statement you like that you think will provoke debate. So this one, people spend so much time these days recording their experiences on digital media that they forget to enjoy the experience itself. Okay? And I'm now going to give you a list of statements. I want you to be as honest as you can and just to say which of the statements that I'm going to show you reflects best your reaction, your immediate reaction to that statement. Okay? So there we go. And again, honestly, could you just tell the person next to you which of those A to F statements best reflects your reaction? Okay, I'll stop you there. So as I said, this is an activity you can do with your students. The idea, and I'll come on to this a bit later, is we're not talking about teaching critical thinking. We're just talking about sensitizing students to it and perhaps seeing to what extent they might possess that kind of mindset already. I don't know what you said about this, but let's just translate this into critical thinking terms. The first three would reflect a fairly uncritical kind of view. So I'm not interested in this topic. Well, you may not be, but you've got to try and engage with it in some way. I agree it's true and I disagree it's false. The same thing. You're not particularly giving any reasons for your judgments. It's just a sort of straight, flat answer. Okay, the next one becomes a bit semi-critical because you're now giving reasons for what you do. And the last two kind of are more critical. I'm not sure. Somebody who wants to investigate and pursue the thing. And the same thing in the last case is perhaps almost like the holy grail of critical thinking. They give a reason and then they'd like to test out that reason a bit more, put it to the test. Okay, it's just an activity to kind of, as I say, sensitize students or find out to what level they might possess a critical mindset. I'll go back to where I was before, which we got to the point of why critical thinking in ELT. And I showed you the statement, which I said was a kind of generic criticism of the education systems at large. It could apply to an education system anywhere in the world, really. The idea that we're not teaching students just to pass tests, but we're actually trying to get them to learn and think for themselves, to think a bit more independently. You can hear that debate here in the UK because they're testing children more and more often at lower and lower ages. Perhaps it applies slightly less in ELT within the UK, but it certainly applies to the teaching of language all over the world, in state schools all over the world. Here's another very interesting fact. I say it's a fact. I think we could apply a bit of critical thinking here. This was something from the something called the what was it? The Foundation, International Foundation for the Future, or Forum for the Future, I think it was. And they came up with this statistic. I don't know on what basis they produced this, but I'd like to think that there was some truth in it. Maybe the figure of 85% is questionable. But a lot of people are bandying about figures like this and saying this, that because of the rate of change, particularly with artificial intelligence, that we don't really know what people are going to be doing, what jobs they're going to be doing 20 years from now, or even 15 years from now, 12 years from now. So that seems to push the argument that really all we can do, we can't actually provide people with the knowledge they're going to need. What we can do is provide them with the skills they're going to need, basically that skill being to learn how to learn. That is the critical thing. So that's one reason, that's one basic reason for critical thinking. You thought you were going to get away without seeing Bloom's taxonomy and the famous coloured triangle. I have no idea where this coloured triangle came from. It's not in any book that was published by Bloom or Bloom himself, or even by the people who revised this taxonomy 50 years later. Anyway, there it is. We're all familiar with it now. The interesting thing about Bloom himself, who's writing in 1956, was that he himself was seeking to address that imbalance in the education system. He did a survey of what children were being taught in secondary education. He found that there was far too much weight being given to knowledge-based learning, that is to say, to the lower levels of the triangle here, to the act of, particularly to the act of remembering and understanding, and that very little attention was being paid in the education system to what's known now as these higher order thinking skills of analysing and evaluating. And all he was advocating, and I'll come back to this because it's all I'm kind of advocating, is that there should be a kind of balance between these things in any education system. It shouldn't be weighted for one or the other. So, if we just look at the range of thinking skills, I just want to... Had everyone come across this before? Or Most people come across this before. Not come across it before. Okay, so it's a hierarchy of thinking skills. We'll talk about the fact that it's a hierarchy in a moment. And it starts with the idea that you remember something, you then understand it, you then try to apply that new knowledge. And beyond that, you can then analyze the knowledge, look more closely, look more deeply into it, come up with some sort of evaluation of your analysis, and finally that you create ideas. So this is the pinnacle, that you produce something creative and independent of your own. Let's just look at that in a particular example. We'll look at a particular word, which is the word expat. Okay? So the students see the word expat in a text. Okay? And it's a text about, shall we say, about French people living in London, for example. They say there are a lot of expats living in London. So the first part of in this pyramid of learning is to remember the word, is to recognize the word. They recognize it in the text, and then they remember it. They now try and understand it, and they find a definition of it, and the definition is simply somebody who moves from their native country to live and work in another. Okay? So then perhaps we try and apply it, and we give another example. We say, oh, there are a lot of British expats living in Spain, on the south coast of Spain. Now we try and analyze the word, and we say, how and where is this term used particularly? And if you go in the newspaper, something quite interesting happens now, is that you find that the term, who is the term used of expat, typically? British people, commonly. Anyone else?
Diplomats.
Yes. Yeah.
City workers, upper middle class people.
Yes. It is. It tends to be, it's rich people, usually from Western countries, who move to work in another rich country, usually. So then we have to now try and evaluate it, because if you looked at the word migrant, you would actually come up with a very similar definition. It's somebody who moves from their native country to live and work in another. So what's the difference now between migrant and expat? In fact, it's a rather insidious difference that it's a kind of almost like a code, if you like, that journalists use and others use to designate migrants who come from poorer countries, sometimes economic migrants, sometimes even refugees are called migrants and so on, versus expats who are really rich people, usually with professional jobs, who move from one country to the other. And it's a very important thing that if we're not careful about the use of such language, that it enters our consciousness without our thinking about it. So, I mean, that's one of the important reasons is how is language use, is the analysis of language use. It's an important reason for critical thinking. So those are the steps. We've remembered the word, we've understood it, we've applied it, but we don't really know it until we've analysed it and evaluated it, and perhaps, as I say, compared it with this word here. As a creative activity, you might simply do something like that. Ask your students to explain the difference now, once they've evaluated it, analysed it and evaluated it, to explain the difference to your partner or to someone else. So that's Bloom's taxonomy. I'd like to see critical thinking in that taxonomy in the following way. That I'd like to separate really into three areas. Basic comprehension, which means remembering and understanding, and perhaps a bit of applying. So, yeah, I'll give you some examples in a moment. A good example would be remembering is like identifying a word next to a picture or something like that. And that would be would encompass understanding as well. Applying it might be a matching exercise or something like that. You've then got critical thinking, which is basically and usually associated with these two things, evaluating and analysing, but actually, for me, takes in applying, can take in more of applying also, and even some of understanding. There's obviously a difference between understanding a very simple text, like a cooking recipe or something like that, and a much more dense text, like, I don't know, a philosophical treatise or something like that. You're going to need to think much more critically just to get that sort of understanding, or a proper understanding of it in the first place. And it also, perhaps, also covers a little bit of creative thinking as well. Why is that? Because, I don't know about you, I hate that term, think outside the box. And often find it's quite, I don't know why people use it, so they say think outside the box, as if just on demand, by snapping your fingers, you could expect someone to be productive or creative in that way. I think there is a process of critical thinking involved in creative thinking. That is to say, when you give somebody a framework in which to operate, it's much easier for them then to come up with ideas. So if they then build a framework through analysis and kind of evaluation, that they then would find it easier to create something. So those are the levels. I'll just go through this now. Why, we'll just go over it again, why use critical thinking tasks? One reason is to get this deeper understanding that I was just talking about. And that's particularly important because teaching materials now are increasingly content-based. They're less written just with the purpose of teaching specific items of language and more with, more in the sort of authentic feel and the idea of engaging students' interest in real-world content. So that's one reason. Once you ask them then to think more critically about text, it increases their engagement with it, and this perhaps touches a little bit on something that Howard was saying, which is that it also kind of increases their interest in language, insofar as they're now, as they think more critically about the language used in a particular text or a particular piece of discourse, they might be comparing it to how such language is used in their own first language. It throws light on their own thinking processes, so it does have that aspect of metacognition, and that in itself can lead to greater learner autonomy. It allows for deeper processing of language, simply insofar as the more aspects of thinking that you use and the more parts of your brain you use, the deeper you will process the object of learning, the language itself. And the last point, and this is probably the most important point that I want to make, is that it creates balanced thinking in your lessons. So when you're lesson planning, just as you would try to find a balance of, say, heads up and heads down activities in your lesson, or a balance between presentation and practice, so it makes a lot of sense to factor in a balance of thinking activities. So there are activities like drills and so on, which are sort of basic remembering exercises or matching exercises which are applying. And there may be some more creative thinking activities in it. Personalization would be another example of applying. There may also be some critical thinking activities in it. For example, evaluating a written model. That would be an example of something critical, an evaluative thing, and so on. Okay, and I think that's very important. So just try and factor in a balance of thinking skills, because it will allow, as it says here, for deeper processing of language. Okay. I come back to this point, this sort of often quoted thing. You're thinking, why? A lot of these things happen. People talk about teaching 21st century skills, teaching this and that, and you come back to the idea, hang on, why are they telling me this? I'm teaching language. I'm a language teacher. Why should I be teaching critical thinking? I'm not actually proposing that anyone teaches critical thinking. Your students may already be very good critical thinkers. They may already possess those skills. All I'm kind of suggesting is that you apply critical thinking to improve the teaching and learning of language. So really by asking yourself this question, when you approach any text, when you approach any item of language, will basic comprehension and application of this language be sufficient to learn it? Or is there value, both for learning and for memory, particularly, to be added by asking students to consider the language or the particular text or piece of discourse more deeply? And that's really the question you should always be asking yourself. We could take this at a very basic level, the level of, I'll come on to this a little bit later, the question of at what level you teach critical thinking. But this is actually in a beginner's book, when they're just learning simple greetings and farewells. And on a basic, the difference between kind of basic and deeper understanding, we could look at it in this way, that the basic understanding would be, first of all, distinguishing which of these are hello and which are goodbye. Secondly, at what time of day you might say one or the other of them. And thirdly, whether they're formal or informal. Those are three things that will get you the kind of basic understanding of how to use these words. If you want to understand them at a deeper level, what you're really asking then probably is how frequently each are used by native speakers themselves. For example, how often, in what context do we actually say good afternoon and good evening? Perhaps not very often, and perhaps only in certain specific contexts. And perhaps the second thing for deeper understanding is what formal and informal really means in this context. Well, again, to go back to how that's not a conversation that you would have with a beginner in English, probably. You might well have it in their own language. But that's not to say that's not a question that they're not going to be asking. They might well be asking those questions, because they might be comparing similar words and expressions in their own language. So what we're going to do is now look at, we've got to the how, is look at critical thinking as applying to the different skills. So first of all, the receptive skills, that is reading and listening. And I'm going to give you a handout here. Okay. So all I've given you there, if you look at item 2, item 1 was the first task that we did, just so you've got it there on a page. The second, it's sometimes very difficult to think if you haven't seen the specific activities. It's quite difficult to conceive of what I'm talking about or what I mean. I hope some of the activities I show you will explain that more clearly. I've given you, in any case, a list of possible... It's a sample list. It's not a definitive list by any means. But it's a possible list here, or sample list here, of critical thinking activities that you might apply to discourse, either written discourse or spoken discourse. Okay? So you can see things like identifying the author or speaker's aims and whether they were achieved, recognizing perspective or the stance of different parties, the writers or the speakers in this case, identifying the main argument and sub-arguments, and so on, looking for evidence, that type of thing. So you can look at that later. What I'm going to do now is just to show you that, give you a kind of more global activity or global question as what we're doing each time we look at a text or a piece of discourse is to ask these questions. What's the real meaning and purpose of this text? If you like, what's going on here? If you like, what's the speaker or writer trying to say and trying to do? And the next question, are they successful in this? And if so, how did they achieve success? And if they're not, how and why did they fall short of that target? That kind of encapsulates, in fact, I think most of those activities there are a kind of subset of those kind of generic questions. So we're going to look at it in terms of a text. And the text is called, it was a C1 text, and it's called The Enigma of Beauty. And it's about, the question is in the text, what is beauty? So, can everyone see it okay? I'll just read it to you anyway as we go. So, define beauty. Some say you might as well analyse a soap bubble. that beauty is relative. Yet it does seem there are some universal characteristics. According to a German study, Braun et al., 2001, people find certain features, a narrow face, full lips, long eyelashes, more attractive than their opposites. Psychologists have also tested the attractiveness of different faces on children and found that we prefer faces that are symmetrical and features that are average or not extreme. But does any of this really matter? Beauty, after all, is a superficial quality. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what we look like, but how we act. As the writer Dorothy Parker said, beauty is only skin deep. Does anybody know the rest of the quote? Oh, ugly goes clean to the bone, yes. So, fine, that was actually a kind of condensed version of the longer text. So, comprehension. So let's just go back to these ideas of the pyramid, of the taxonomy. Do you remember any of the universal characteristics that were mentioned? Can anyone?
Narrow face.
Yeah, narrow face. Yeah.
Symmetry.
Yes, symmetry was another one. Full lips. Good, good, good. What does the author think about the importance of beauty? What did the author say about whether it was important or not? No. That was the idea. Okay, that's the basic message that they were trying to get across. And if you wanted to apply some of the language in it, you might ask a question like this. How else do we judge? So beauty might be one thing. How else could we judge people in a superficial way? To apply this word superficial, this concept of superficial judgment. How can you think of any examples of how people are judged superficially? The clothes they wear. Yeah, the job they do, exactly, as a sign of their status, exactly. Perhaps their voice, their accent, where they come from, and so on. Good, okay. So those are those basic levels. Let's look at the text now critically. And I guess it's not always absolutely clear what task you might have applied to do it. Remember what I said was one of the whys for doing this was to engage students more in the text, was to try and get them more involved in the text and more involved in the language, more involved in the lesson in general. And so the particular task for this, it may seem like quite an academic task, but it'll get a little bit more interesting in a moment. So the question was, what are the sources for the following statements? Does anybody remember? Sorry, it's a bit unfair. Did I give you the text? No, I didn't. How horrible of me. Sorry, I should have put it on the thing. We can go back to the text. Does anybody remember this one? We find certain features, full lips. It was, yeah, so we just go back to it. It was Braun et al. Yes, good. Good, that's right. That was that one. And then we prefer average features. Yes, it was a study of children, but in this case, the text just said psychologists have also tested. So in this case, you get a kind of reference, a proper reference, academic reference. Here, it just says psychologists have also tested, but maybe it carries weight because psychologists, yeah, you tend to believe that it was from a similar study. It's how we act, not look, that's important. Where did that? That was the writer's view, yeah. And the last one, beauty is only skin deep, was a quote of Dorothy Parker. Okay, so the students look for the evidence and look for how the evidence was supported. And now they try and evaluate it and answer these questions. Could you just do this together? So which of those statements, just remembering how they were sourced, which statement is most reliable, do you think? And secondly, and not necessarily the same question, which one had the most impact on you and why is that? So which of these statements do you feel is the most reliable, and which one had the most impact on you, and why is that? Could you just tell each other? Which statement did you think was most reliable? A, yeah, okay. It was given a proper academic citing. It was you could look up the research. You could see where it was. Okay, and which had the most impact on you? Which is perhaps a more the same thing. Oh, that's interesting.
Yes,
Okay.
because at least that represents some novel information.
Okay. Okay.
But I think the ones that you tend to believe would have the most impact.
Yes. Yes. That.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's saying
No, I think that's
the
true.
attitude, then why would you-
I think that's true. And students often say, actually, this one, really.
It's the finest thing.
A quote can often be a powerful thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Particularly as you say, if it resonates with you in a particular way. Okay. So we saw the different stages of that: the sort of remembering, the understanding, the applying, the analysing, the evaluating. What was the creative activity for this? I think they design an advert or something for something good, for a beauty product. Productive skills. Okay, so speaking and writing. You're probably most familiar with critical thinking in relation to the receptive skills, listening and reading. It's not only that by any means. Having said that, you're probably familiar with the kind of activity I'm going to do now. You probably just didn't know it was, or hadn't called it, critical thinking. This text, it's a review of a book by Thornton Wilder, an American writer. He didn't write very much, but he wrote this one very famous novel. Has anybody read it? Or? Okay, so we're going to look at the review. It's on your sheet. And I think it goes over the page. Yeah, and I'll just read it as we go. So it's task 3. So this is the text we're working with, and I'll just read it to you quickly. In 1714, a rope suspension bridge in Peru snaps, and the 5 people on the bridge fall to their deaths. By chance, Brother Juniper, a Franciscan monk, witnesses this tragedy. He's not only troubled by what he has seen, but also troubled by why this should have happened. Why at this precise moment? Why these 5 people? Accordingly, he sets out to find out something about the lives of each person, and so to make sense of the tragedy. This short novel, only 124 pages long, is a beautiful reflection on the subject of destiny. It's not a true story, but some of the characters are based on real people. Written in wonderfully eloquent prose, each chapter describes the life of one of the 5 people on the bridge. From the aristocratic Marquesa de Montemayor, who longs to be back in her native Spain, to the wise Uncle Pio, whose lifelong ambition to make a star of a young actress is in the end frustrated. Our interest is kept alive not by the mystery of their deaths, but by the compelling characters that Wilder has drawn so vividly, each eccentric in their own way and each very human in their virtues and in their faults. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Okay? So it's a model of a review. First of all, we just analyse the review, and if you just remember the questions, the generic questions, the same ones that we applied to discourse for receptive skills. What's the real purpose of this text? What's the author, or what's the writer in this case, trying to do, and are they successful? If so, how have they been successful, and if not, why not? So we'll just have a look. So these are the questions you'd ask the student. What kind of book is being reviewed? It's a kind of work of fiction, exactly. Historical novel. What's it about? Yes, a tragedy and about destiny. What does the reviewer, what did he like or dislike about it? Any characterization, yes, and so on. Good. Okay. And then you might ask yourself these questions in a critical way. What's the author of the review trying to do? What techniques does he use to achieve this, and does he succeed or fail? Again, just quickly, could you try and answer those questions to each other? Okay, I'll stop you there. Could I just ask you, did you think it was a successful review? Did it, for example, did it make you want to read the book? Yeah, you should. It's good. It's a good book. Only 124 pages. So, what is there to lose? No, it's a very good book, and weirdly, it's the only good book he wrote. So, why was it successful? How did it make you want to read the book? Anybody like to suggest?
Interesting language, uses adverb adjectives.
There's that. There's some powerful adjectives. Yeah.
Actually, knowing that there must be some trick to it, because we're talking about critical thinking and trying to
No, it's not a particular trick.
But some good things, like good prose, I thought, okay, it's well written,
Yeah.
and the premise itself is interesting.
Yeah.
So try to look at the facts, but the adjectives.
Yeah. I mean,
Involves the reader as well, asking direct questions.
Yes.
Like our.
Yes. I mean, for me, it was partly the way they just told the beginning of the story and then left. You really want to know what happened, why these people, why this happened to these people. That's what the monk wants to know. He wants to know if God has a plan or not. So maybe something we all want to know. Yeah, and I mean, what's going on here is something you all do anyway. Is showing students a written model or a spoken model before they try something out themselves, be that a discursive essay or a letter or a little presentation or something like that. The difference here is that you're actually getting them to examine the model and to say what they think is, and to sort of find out what works about it, what doesn't work about it, what they like about it, whether they could adopt that or not. You might then give them different structures for a review and they could compare them to that, and if they think that might be more suit their style of writing or style of speaking, they could choose that. The idea is that idea of analysing something helps them then produce something. It gives them a framework in which to produce something. Good. So those are those questions again, coming up again. What am I trying to do here? Am I trying to describe what the book is about, or describe the way it's written? Am I going to recommend it or not? How am I going to do this? Am I going to tell part of the story as they did? Am I going to give an overview simply? Am I going to try and use persuasive language or simply be sort of straight and objective? An important question, how will I know if I've been successful? Am I going to give it to someone else to read? Read it back myself, and so on. So often this kind of critical thinking with productive skills is about studying models and then setting criteria by which you want your own discourse to be judged. And that process of setting those criteria should help you to achieve the goals that you've now set yourself. So you might do the same thing for a talk. If the title of the talk was, what do you think is your nationality's greatest characteristic, and why do you admire this? You might then ask different questions about your aim. Am I trying to convince people? Am I trying to entertain people? What am I trying to do? My audience, what assumptions can I make about what they know already about this subject? My argument, what's my main argument, and how am I going to get it across? What examples am I going to provide? The medium of the message, am I going to do this only with words? Am I going to use some visuals? How am I best going to convey that? And again, the result, how am I going to know if I'm going to be if I've been successful in getting my message across? How can I check that? Or is it perhaps that I want to prompt action of some sort? Okay, the same principle of setting criteria. Critical thinking with grammar and vocabulary. Again, something you probably do a lot of all the time, using, for example, an inductive approach. Just that idea of giving students time to reflect, perhaps compare Again, as Howard was saying, compare structures with the way a particular structure, your target language, works with how it works in their own language. I don't know if anyone's come across this guy, James Zull, but he said this about reflection. It's the stage of learning. We've got kind of perception and then reflection, and then abstraction and then creation. This stage of reflection, this second stage where you give people time to turn something over in their mind, is something we just all, to a person, hurry our students through too much. And that's what he said. Even the quickest learner needs time. You must let your brain do its thing. If she doesn't, her ideas and memories will be disconnected and shallow. So just give them more time to evaluate work, to evaluate grammar, to understand grammar. So an inductive approach is one way of doing it. I know they love to see the answer. I know they love to see a sort of tenses expressed in terms of a timeline or whatever, and that's fine, I think, as a kind of consolidation. But when they're first encountering something and getting to know what it's about, then try and let them work it out for themselves. So you've got these types of activity: inductive reasoning, contrastive analysis, all things you probably do already, comparing tenses and so on, getting them to rephrase things, express the same idea but with a different grammatical form, getting them to question the syntax. Would it be possible to say the same thing by moving the words around, or is there any possibility of moving the words around? And error correction as well, of course, analysing why when somebody says something wrong, it is wrong. Good. And vocabulary. Sorry, because I am running out of time now. You might apply, you're not going to apply critical thinking to obviously concrete items. You're much more going to do it with things such as phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs, very difficult thing to learn because they're always restricted in their application. They always have a very restricted application. You can't just say, get on with means to have a good relationship with, because it doesn't always work when you substitute it. So, and typically what you do is you use this model, the PPP model. They see verbs in context, they match them to definitions, they do a gap fill exercise, and then they talk about friends and family. What hasn't happened there is the kind of critical thinking part with these verbs. You must ask questions like this: how does it work grammatically? So you can use get on without it has no object there. You can say we get on well. You can use it with a adverb, or with if you use an object, you have to use with it. How does it work semantically? You can look up to someone, but you can't look up to an abstract thing. You can't look up to someone's decision, for example. And how do you use it with the correct register? You can say we used to hang out together a lot, but you can't really say the president hangs out a lot with her advisor. It's not possible. So it's that type of question, getting students to engage with the language more critically. Okay? Does anyone have any questions about what I've said so far? Or level. Next slide. Yeah, no, I could do. I mean, I will. I'll just very quickly explain. I mean, there is this idea, that lower language level. It's been a kind of equation, or let's put it another way, that higher language level means higher cognitive level. But of course, that's not true, and it is quite difficult. This is a little text about the Mini, okay? And it was about how the Mini is a global product. I don't know if you know about the Mini car. It's made in Oxford, where I come from, but it's not actually made in Oxford, where I come from, because there are 2,500 parts to the Mini, and they come from countries all over the world. Not only they do that, they keep going backwards and forwards. So some part will cross a border. It'll come, or not actually a border at the moment, but will come to Britain to have something done to it and then return to France to have something else to it and then go to Germany and then come back again like that. So they move around all the time. So it is a global product, and that's what this was just an element of the B1 text, in fact, sorry, pre-intermediate text. And it just asks what nationality is this car? And it says it's a global product. So the idea of, with lower levels, at a higher level, you might do an activity like this, inferring meaning. What conclusions can you draw about these sorts of things, the importance of Mini's heritage to BMW, the practices of other car producers, the main factors in the cost of car production. So quite high-level stuff. There's no reason why you can't ask similar questions, but simply by supporting the student more and grading the language. So why do you think BMW wanted to make Minis in Britain? That's really connected to its heritage because it had always been made here before. Do you think other car producers make global products? Well, it's said in the text, the guy's kind of referred to it here. Yes. The wider car producers make their car parts, so obviously suggesting they do. And the last one, do you think it's cheaper or more expensive? So it's to do with grading the language, asking simpler questions and supporting the learner in the activity. Is that really critical thinking? That is a good question. What it's trying to do is sort of sensitize the student to the idea of critical thinking, and trying to coach them along the way. And I think you'll find a lot of schools around the world now, primary schools, people are doing this. They're trying to inculcate this kind of idea of critical thinking at a very early age now. There are a lot of supporters of it. So it's about support and grading of language. You can see the term inferring meaning has here just become reading between the lines. Which leads me to, that was the summary, but I'll just leave me with this point. Is critical things, this is what somebody said to me just the other day, actually. They asked me this question, is critical thinking, isn't it just thinking, really? And I think, perhaps it is in some ways, yes. There are some similarities with Jim Scrivener and his demand high approach, that idea of challenging people more, just getting them to do more, to think more, not just feeding them stuff, knowledge-based stuff. There are some ideas with that. I'm not quite sure that this is true, that it's just thinking, because I think there are these different levels of thinking. But anyway, I'll leave that one with you. Thanks very much.